Hi, Stephen.
Hi, good morning.
Thanks very much for agreeing to this interview. Stephen, can I ask you to start by introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, no problem. So I'm Stephen Baker, and I'm the Chief Executive at East Suffolk Council.
Thank you. I've got 4 questions for you, and the first one is one I ask almost everybody. It's partly personal and it's partly about your sort of leadership role. How are you looking after yourself during this pandemic, and how are you supporting your team?
Right. So in terms of looking after myself, I think I'm getting better. I think, to be perfectly frank, there's a lot of talk about grades at the moment. So I think in terms of looking after myself, I probably started at a D. I'm now up to about a C, and I'm aspiring to get a B or possibly even an A. But when the pandemic first hit, initially there was a lot of flurry, and then suddenly when there was all the lockdown and the implications of all of that, the working week, the working hours, the working day really just went off the scale, and you just have to put all of that sort of stuff first. So exercise wasn't a great thing for me, but now we're gradually getting back into it, and so we're starting to look after. I'm starting to look after myself better, if you will. In terms of support for the teams, we've had to adapt and change incredibly quickly. So it's been about supporting people in that new working environment very, very quickly. We were lucky, we had the IT in place that enabled people to work from home, but of course it's a totally different context for people to work from home. And some people were working from home, some people were coming in order to support the community, the folk that were dealing with food supplies or coordinating voluntary help and this sort of thing. So it was, in terms of supporting people, it was very much around the softer issues. It was about assurance. It was about giving people confidence. It was about, especially communications. That was really important. But it was about being flexible and adaptable. And it was, in my view, very much around seeing people as individuals, just not teams of staff, but individuals within those teams. Because when you looked at every individual circumstance, some people, perhaps a partner or somebody was shielded. Maybe they had caring responsibilities. Suddenly they were trying to homeschool. I can think of one of my team. She's a manager of a team, and she was explaining to me how she was sat at the dining room table trying to do her thing, and her son, who's I think is 8 now, she was trying to homeschool him alongside. Again, everybody had a different context, so it was just supporting them, making sure people had the confidence and the assurance that the council, as an employer, was prepared to back them up on that. So that worked well. There's that phrase, isn't there? To understand the situation, you need to walk a mile in somebody's shoes. Well, I just think we needed to adapt that and understand where individuals are coming from, both as staff, but also as people within the community.
I won't talk about moderating your grading for yourself, but I like what you said about self-realization about your own situation and the workload, because that makes you think about the fact that this is the way it's impacted on your teams as well. And your description of your manager at home, yes, our homes have become an office, a workplace, the home, maybe student lodgings, it's a whole range of things. Yeah. So it's changed us and our lifestyles a lot, doesn't it?
It has, and in order to adapt, you have to, what you're having to adapt to respond to. So raising that level of awareness has been absolutely critical, and of course communications has been in itself. I'm here. Happen to be in the office today, but normally I walk down the floor plate and you can talk to people, catch up with people, ask people how they are, maybe talk about the football score or whatever. And of course, if you're sat at home, there's none of that. So it's been very different.
Thank you. My second question is this. So how has the situation affected your leadership responsibilities? And in addition to that, has it affected councillors and the democratic process?
Yeah. Interesting. I was talking to somebody about this just yesterday. In terms of leadership, yes, absolutely. As sort of the head of the paid service for the council, as the leader, you have to adapt to the circumstance. You have to reflect the different circumstances in how you behave and what you're looking to do, to make sure that you're supporting people within the organisation as best as you can. I have to say, initially, I felt compromised as a leader by this. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, you want to provide leadership by example. So, I was expecting folk to work from home. We were in lockdown. So it was important that I worked from home as well and demonstrated, A, I could do it, and B, I understood how people were struggling perhaps with it or adapting to it or whatever. On the other hand, I also need to provide visible leadership. And so some of the staff were still out there doing the day job. We adapted things so that the bins were still being emptied. Our communities teams were still out there supporting the community and working with the various other organisations, county councils, voluntary sector, to make sure that support was there for the community and for the vulnerable in the community. So I wanted to come in every so often to meet those folk and find out how they were getting on, and where possible make a difference, because there were a few issues sometimes that they were coming up against, and once I was aware of those, I could then take those away, talk to people within organisations and try and come up with a solution. So in terms of my my leadership responsibilities, it's shifted and changed, but equally responding to working with other organisations, that partnership, that collaborative approach that was necessary became very important, as you'll be aware, and so we were working on that a lot as well. And essentially, we've just had to continue to deliver, but deliver differently, very differently in many circumstances. For councillors, this has been quite a challenge, I think, for a period of time. Our councillors, some of our councillors have ended up being shielded. Of course, they couldn't join and have meetings as they have done before, so we had to go to remote meetings, online meetings. That demanded a different skill set in some instances, technical skills perhaps. It is different to being online, especially if you've got several people on a call. The body language is different, the communications are different, how you sort of indicate that you want to vote is very different. So councillors have had to adapt. But equally, a councillor isn't just a person that comes into the office and makes it and votes. They're a community representative. So their engagement with that community, suddenly, they're in lockdown. They were no longer walking down the street and perhaps meeting somebody at the post office or in Tesco's or whatever. It was a very different context. So the councillors themselves needed to adapt. And I have to say, so people like the leader of the council very much got involved in providing communications to his colleague members, talking to the other leaders of the different groups to make sure that flow of comms was going through and passing through all the time. He put a lot of work into that. And of course, as the effect of the pandemic stretched out, we could make, let's say it was a couple of weeks. You can get away with perhaps not having a planning meeting or something for a couple of weeks. That's not a problem. Couple of months, that's a bit harder. 6 months, no, I'm sorry, you've got to start getting some of those democratic processes back in place. And so the members have been very supportive and very positive in adapting to that, to make sure that they can continue to deliver the services for local communities that they want to do.
Fascinating. Yeah, and I hadn't thought about the sort of political impact for a local authority like yours. But I'm also glad to hear that you were able to adapt your sort of leadership earlier on, when you talked about the fact that you couldn't ignore the fact that you've got teams that had to continue providing face-to-face services despite the lockdown.
Yeah, absolutely. And all credit to the community as well. Perhaps folk that would normally have wanted to come in to talk to people face to face, suddenly they were doing it over the phone. Yeah, I mean that flexibility, that agility that was demonstrated was amazing, absolutely amazing. You know, so you got people who would normally sit in an office dealing with calls from the public, suddenly they're dealing with it from home, and the way that the colleagues were very supportive of one another, looking out for each other, and just sort of keeping an eye on people in their different contexts. That was really encouraging. It was brilliant.
Good to hear. My third question is this: what have been the noteworthy positives and negatives caused by the pandemic?
Right. Well, I think the negatives, I mean, we have to acknowledge the sort of the obvious ones, really. I mean, the losses, the impact on families. Yeah. So those are clearly significant, hugely significant. The impact of being furloughed, the economic impacts on businesses. So, but we know about those. We know about those. Something which has been almost unearthed, I would suggest, is an underlying, and I've mentioned this to some colleagues, we've been made aware of an underlying fragility within the community. So, we used to have what it was the old normal, and people they had jobs and they had families and they were okay, and they didn't need to resort to any sort of welfare support, and they were fine. They were just above the line, if you like. They were okay. Suddenly, they're perhaps furloughed, perhaps they're shielded, or their partner's shielded. Suddenly, they're trying to look after youngsters at home rather than sending them to school. So maybe school meals are significant, and they're no longer there. And that fragility is being exposed because suddenly they're having to say, oh, hold on a minute, I need to apply for universal credit, or I need some support, or, where do I go for help? And that's been quite, I think that's been quite a stark reality that we've come to understand and realise that, what we assume as the normal is quite vulnerable in many ways. So that's certainly a bit of a negative in that regard. And I think there's a lesson that we've learned from that we need to be ready with those support mechanisms just in case. I know, I mean, there was a family, I'm not going to mention any names, but they contacted us. Husband, I think the mum was shielded. Husband had been furloughed, but he'd only been in the job a couple of weeks. So he wasn't getting any pay or anything like that. They'd applied for universal credit, but it was going to take a while for that to come through. And they contacted us because they had barely a fiver in the bank. They had no food in the cupboard. And they were saying, help, can you? But the encouraging thing was those folk, they were saying, but once our universal credit comes through, that's okay. We won't need any help then. We can go back to being independent. So there was that realism, that stoicism, if you like, was there. That independence, that fierce sort of spirit was there, but they just needed that help to get them through that difficult period of time. In terms of the positives, well, it's demonstrated what can be done in the face of adversity. Wow. I mean, as an organisation, we're a fairly decent sized organisation, by population, we're the biggest district council in the country, hundreds of staff, and suddenly, almost overnight, they're working from home, they're adapting to doing things in a different way, they're delivering a phenomenally different approach to the community to support them through all of those issues which the communities were facing. So I think that's a positive. It showed people what can be done. And it's demonstrated that we have that flexibility, that agility if we want to exercise it. It's amazing what can be done. We took a fairly permissive approach to things like grants and hardship funds, and because especially the members, they drove this. The leader of the council drove this and wanted to, let's not make it bureaucratic or difficult. Let's get the support out there, which was really important. The other sort of, the way we worked across organisations, I think, was a positive. Barriers just came down. Although I have to say the Suffolk system has always been a very collaborative one. The organisations within Suffolk have always worked very well together. There's been strong partnership themes, and that I think helped us. It almost accelerated our response, so that worked really, really well. And then if you go off at a slight tangent, things like environmental benefits, and we know that there's been that. Yeah, so the mileage and all that sort of thing has come down, but suddenly the sky was a lot clearer, and you know. So yeah, so there have certainly been a number of positives out of it, and some people have reacted and sort of seen some things as opportunities. Looking ahead, I think the challenge is going to be building on some of those positives.
Yeah, I think any emergency, and particularly one this large and this broad, accentuates strengths in the system, but it also exposes weaknesses, doesn't it? Yeah. And what you were describing earlier on in answer to this question about the experiences of people who were on the cusp of being able to live independently prior to the pandemic, but were finding themselves requiring help either for a short term or maybe of a longer term. The CABs have been describing this, the Citizens Advice Bureaus, throughout. In fact, they've said that the cohort of people that have been the clients that have come to them during the pandemic, especially during the lockdown, were very different to the people that they were seeing prior to that. And they were exactly the kind of people that you were describing, who had lived independently, hadn't sought advice, help of that kind, but found themselves in that situation.
Yeah, I'm absolutely right. I mean, some years ago, I did a it's all right, Joe's there. I did a secondment, a sort of job swap with the manager of the local CAB.
All right.
And so I spent a day I don't remember, and Nick Mayo, when she used to be the Leyston Centre manager, and it was fascinating because, as you say, going on and being part of that and just seeing, I was allowed to spend a couple of times on the interviews, and that worked, as an insight into the challenges that people faced. That was quite remarkable. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Stephen, thank you. I've got my last question is this, and again, I asked this of most of my interviewees. What learning and challenges do you think will come from the outbreak, and will there be any long-term effects?
Yeah, I think the learning is all around that piece that I've already talked about. You know, the need to be agile, the need to be flexible, the need to be responsive in a different way. The other piece of learning I think we need to hold on to is that people are people, they're not numbers. I think we've got into the habit throughout this COVID thing of seeing people as numbers, you know, because of the numbers that you hear, the stats and so on and so forth. And if I look at my own staff, every single member of staff has different circumstances, different pressures, different issues to sort of address. And of course, that's replicated throughout with that in the community. And going back to the point you were making about the fragility within the community. So I think something we need to learn is, let's focus on place, focus on people, because that's where the difference can really be made. I have a concern that we may forget some of the things that we should have learned from this. So I'll give you an example. Clap for carers. I mean, people have probably forgotten that we did it now, haven't they? Do you remember standing out on the pavements, banging pots and pans and the clap and all that sort of thing? And yet we haven't done it for a few weeks, and I would suggest that it's probably forgotten now. People sort of say, oh yeah, okay, we moved on. Well, do you know what? We can't afford to lose that, because that was part of the fabric of the pandemic response, and it just demonstrated how important those key workers were. So we mustn't lose that. And so it's making sure that we grasp some of those lessons and don't forget them. That's really, for me, some of those sort of long-term effects. Being prepared to do things differently is critical in my view. And the other thing for us is, because we have a set of staff values here, and it's just reiterated those staff values to us, working as a team, taking responsibility, being honest with each other. But it's also sort of, if you like, opened us up to other people's values, and you know, sort of within the community, and how you can work with, you know, the people in the voluntary sector. I mean, the voluntary sector has just been absolutely outstanding, absolutely outstanding. But beyond that, all those little gestures of the individuals where they've wanted to support colleagues and neighbours and so on and so forth. So those are the lessons which I just hope we can keep hold of and make sure we get a permanent change. I hate this phrase new normal. It's been used too much already. I mean, you know, but we will be moving into an entirely different sort of normality as things move ahead. And I think those strengths are what we need to hold on to make that a success.
No, you're right. It's like a footprint in the sand on the shore, isn't it? The water will wash it away unless you actually keep a memory of that footprint.
Yeah.
And you're right to think in that terms.
Yeah. So let's make it a bit like the dinosaur footprint in the lava, the one that will be there for years to come.
Absolutely.
Not the footprint in the sand. Yeah.
We just those in future will need to work out what it was there for. But now, Stephen, thank you so much for your time and for agreeing to do this interview. That was really interesting. Thank you.
That's okay. No problem. You're welcome.